October 12th, 1982. Los Angeles, California. 35-year-old Sol Salomon, his 39-year-old wife Elaine, and their two children, 15-year-old Michelle and 9-year-old Mitchell, vanished without explanation from their home. Evidence suggests that foul play occurred, and pieces of identification belonging to the family are soon found scattered alongside a freeway. The investigation eventually leads to Harvey Rader, a business acquaintance of Sol's who allegedly killed the entire family and buried their bodies in the desert. Rader is charged with the murders, but after 2 mistrials, he is acquitted at his third trial in 1992, and the Salomon family is never found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we will be covering a missing persons case involving an entire family, the 1982 disappearance of Sol, Elaine, Michelle, and Mitchell Salomon. This case was recently suggested to me by a listener named Aaron, as an extensive article about the story was published in Los Angeles Magazine at the beginning of July. The article was written by author and journalist Stacy Perman, who happened to be a neighbor of the family when they vanished, and childhood friends with Michelle. Sometimes you get requests from listeners about cases you've never heard of before, and they take you down such an intriguing rabbit hole that you immediately feel compelled to do a podcast episode about them. So thank you very much for the suggestion, Aaron. Cases in which entire families go missing are always particularly frightening to me, and today's story is reminiscent of another famous disappearance involving a California family. In 2010, Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their 2 sons, Gianni and Joseph Jr., vanished without a trace, and it became one of the most baffling mysteries of the modern era until the entire family's remains were found buried in the desert over 3 years later. There are a lot of parallels which can be made between the McStay family and Salomon family disappearances, but the key difference is that the Salomons have still never been found. A suspect named Harvey Rader did go on trial for murdering the Salomons and wound up being acquitted, but believe it or not, he has also been connected to a couple of other unsolved disappearances which took place earlier that same year. So we've got a very complicated story to explore in today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is finally on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of the Salomon family. Our story begins in Los Angeles in 1982. One of our central figures is 35-year-old Shlomo Salomon, who goes by the name Sol. Sol lives in Northridge, a neighborhood located in San Fernando Valley, alongside his 39-year-old wife Elaine, his 9-year-old son Mitchell, and his 15-year-old stepdaughter Michelle Hockman. Sol originally hails from Israel and served as an army commando before he moved to the United States in the early 1970s and became a naturalized citizen. Shortly after arriving, Sol met Elaine, a divorcee with a young daughter from her previous marriage, and the couple soon got married and had a son of their own. Sol would go on to form a business involving the repair and refilling of fire extinguishers, which is how he makes his living. On October 12th, Elaine's parents, Murray and Marge Malarowitz, were visiting the Salomon home to have dinner with the family. At 6 p.m., Sol told everyone that he was going to a car auction with a business associate named Harvey Rader and left the house. The Malarowitzes went home at around 10:30, and 1 hour later, Elaine was in the midst of a telephone conversation with her best friend when the doorbell suddenly rang. Elaine told her friend that, quote-unquote, Harvey's at the door, and ended the call, but this would turn out to be the last time anyone from the Salomon family was confirmed to be alive. The following day, Elaine did not show up at the clinic where she worked as a volunteer counselor, and the two children missed school. Neighbors became concerned when they noticed that water was running from a garden hose into the family's pool, but had caused it to overflow and flood the backyard. Though their Mercedes was gone, the family's two other vehicles, a Rolls-Royce and Sol's van from his fire extinguisher business, were parked outside, and their dog was still in the backyard. The police were notified, and when they arrived, they discovered that the house was locked and the burglar alarm was turned off. They eventually made their way inside and soon discovered evidence that violence had taken place in Michelle's bedroom. Her bed was broken, and the pillowcases, sheets, and bedspread were missing. Spatters of blood were found on the mattress and the wall, and a piece of carpet had also been removed from the floor and covered with a bathroom rug. Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates would later be asked how much blood was found, and his response was, quote, "More blood than I would want to lose." It did not appear that a robbery had taken place, as jewelry had been left behind, and thousands of dollars in cash was found inside Sol's office safe. On October 17th, some of the family's possessions, including their passports, wallets, and photos, would be discovered around 15 miles away, scattered in some brush alongside the Antelope Valley Freeway in close proximity to the town of Acton. Of course, the investigation immediately focused on Harvey Rader, as Sol had supposedly been going to see him when he left his home on October 12th, and Elaine had said, "Harvey's at the door," right before she ended her final phone call that night. Rader was a 41-year-old British citizen who had immigrated to the US during the 1970s. He owned a car dealership in Reseda called Mr. Motor of London, where he bought, sold, and repaired expensive used cars. Sol had invested $20,000 in the dealership and often did business with Rader, buying used cars at auctions for Rader to resell. It would turn out that the Salomon family's Mercedes, which was conspicuously missing from their house, was now parked at Rader's garage. When questioned by police, Rader confirmed that he and Sol attended a car auction on the evening of the 12th and arrived there together in Sol's van. Afterward, Sol asked Rader to drop him off at an Israeli restaurant on Ventura Boulevard at around 10:30 p.m. and declined an offer from Sol for them to pick up some hookers together. Rader then drove Sol's van back to his house and rang the doorbell. When Elaine answered, she gave Rader the keys to the family's Mercedes, and he subsequently drove it to his garage for some repair work. Rader also told police that he believed Sol was involved with a group of Israeli nationals in LA known as the Israeli Mafia. Sol allegedly sold guns to the group and transported weapons for them in his work vans. Rader claimed that Sol visited his office the week before he went missing and showed him an Uzi submachine gun worth $1,500 and seemed to be putting forward the idea that these activities may have played a role in Sol's disappearance. However, the problem is that there were inconsistencies in Rader's story. The car auction he supposedly attended with Sol actually ended at 5 p.m., even though Murray and Marge Malarowitz claimed that Sol did not leave his house until 6 o'clock. It also turned out that the restaurant where Rader claimed he dropped Sol off was closed on that particular night, and while Rader said he got the keys for the Mercedes directly from Elaine, he told another version of the story where he said he grabbed the keys from their mailbox. Investigators also noticed some scratches on Rader's hands, though he claimed he had got them from working on his cars. If that wasn't enough, 2 years beforehand, Rader found himself embroiled in an elaborate fencing operation involving valuable pieces of artwork which were stolen from the Beverly Hills mansion of a wealthy Saudi Arabian sheik. In the end, Rader wound up receiving immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying against his co-conspirators. While Rader did raise some red flags with investigators, he denied any involvement in the Salomon family's disappearance, and there was no direct evidence to suggest he was responsible. The case remained at a standstill until November of 1983, when Rader's cousin, Ashley Paul, came forward with a shocking story. Like Rader, Paul was a British citizen who had moved to the US and worked as a salesman at Rader's dealership. After the Salomons went missing, Paul returned to England and got a job as a cab driver in London. Well, during this time period, Paul was frequently hounded by Joe Sampson, a private investigator hired by Marge Malarowitz. Sampson believed that Paul knew more about the disappearances than he was letting on, and Paul apparently cracked under pressure when he was contacted by a woman claiming to be one of Elaine Salomon's relatives, who told Paul that a group of California-based Israelis were planning retribution against him for murdering the family. He finally told Sampson, quote, "Joe, you're right. Harvey's a psycho," end quote. Paul then went to the authorities at Scotland Yard to inform them that Harvey Rader had murdered the Salomons and that he would tell investigators everything he knew in exchange for immunity from prosecution. This message was relayed to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, who agreed to the deal, so Paul was flown to LA to share his story with detectives from the LAPD. Well, it wasn't until after Paul arrived that he admitted to helping Rader cover up the crime, something he did not disclose before his immunity agreement was drafted. According to Paul, on the evening of October 12th, he personally witnessed Rader get into an argument with Sol Salomon inside Rader's office. Sol was demanding repayment of the $20,000 he had invested in the Mr. Motor dealership, but Rader responded by pulling out a gun and shooting him in the head. Paul also claimed that 3 other people were present when Sol's murder took place: a car dealer named Gerald Baxter and 2 Italian men whose names he did not remember. After Sol's body was stuffed into the trunk of a Rolls-Royce, Rader instructed Paul to drive him and the 2 Italians to the Salomon family home. He remained parked in the driveway while Rader and the Italians went inside the house and murdered the family. Rader beat Elaine to death and slammed her head into a marble bar, strangled Michelle, and fatally beat Mitchell to death with a baseball bat. They then placed the 3 bodies inside the trunk of the family's Mercedes and subsequently drove them out to the desert to bury them before taking the Mercedes to Rader's garage. All 4 members of the family were allegedly buried in Antelope Valley near Acton, in close proximity to where their passports and wallets were later found. But believe it or not, Paul revealed that these were not the only murders that Rader had committed. On March 17, 1982, nearly 7 months before the disappearance of the Salomon family, a pair of British immigrants, 54-year-old Peter Davis and his 47-year-old wife Joan, vanished from their home in the Granada Hills neighborhood of San Fernando Valley, located only 2 miles from where the Salomons lived. The couple's dog was also missing, along with their luggage and a valuable painting they owned worth $100,000, but strangely, they had left their dinner cooking on the stove. The Davises' car would soon be discovered in the parking lot of Los Angeles International Airport, but they were never heard from again, and no one really believed that they took off voluntarily. Well, Paul just happened to be the Davises' next-door neighbor at the time they went missing, and previously had a job repairing cars for Peter before he went to work for Rader. At the time they went missing, Paul had admitted to giving Peter a ride home from a car auction on the night he disappeared, which technically made him the last person to see Peter alive, and the Davises often conducted business with Rader at Mr. Motor. Paul now admitted that Rader wanted to steal some valuable artwork from the Davises' home, so he agreed to accompany Rader there under the pretext of buying one of their cars. Rader then proceeded to murder the couple and disposed of their bodies in a desert area off Interstate 5 near Bakersfield. But that still wasn't all. Paul also told police that Rader had admitted to killing a 7th person, a missing Burbank businessman named Ronald Adib, who also supposedly invested money in Mr. Motor. In January of 1982, Adib left his home after telling his family he was going to see a man about cars, but he never returned, and his car was later found parked at Los Angeles International Airport. In this case, Paul claimed he did not witness Adib's murder and had no idea where his body might be. Paul was asked to accompany investigators to the desert near Antelope Valley in order to help them find the Salomon family's bodies, but an extensive search of the area turned up nothing. A search was also performed of the desert off Interstate 5 near Bakersfield in an attempt to find the bodies of Peter and Joan Davis, but once again, nothing was found. Regardless, police arrested Harvey Rader on suspicion of murdering the Salomons, along with Gerald Baxter, the car salesman whom Paul claimed was present when Sol's murder took place. Well, investigators determined that Baxter was not involved and cleared him as a suspect, and Rader would soon be released due to insufficient evidence. By this point, the authorities had really soured on Ashley Paul as a witness. Since his story kept changing, Paul was given 4 separate polygraph tests, and he wound up failing all of them. He finally admitted that he made up certain aspects of his story, as Gerald Baxter was not involved, and the 2 Italian men who supposedly assisted with the murders did not actually exist. By lying, Paul had violated his immunity agreement, and since there was insufficient evidence to prosecute Rader, the district attorney's office decided to drop the hammer on Paul, charging him with 6 counts of first-degree murder for killing the Salomons and the Davises. However, since no bodies could be found, a Los Angeles Municipal Court judge eventually ruled there was also insufficient evidence against Paul. All they really had were Paul's self-incriminating statements, but the judge ruled they should be thrown out because his immunity agreement was not worded properly and therefore should not have been revoked. All the charges against Paul were dismissed. Much to the chagrin of the authorities, he immediately went to the British consulate in Los Angeles and was granted a new passport after telling them his life was in danger, which allowed him to return home to England. Well, in December of 1986, Harvey Rader wound up being deported back to England. It turned out that when he originally immigrated to the United States and applied for permanent resident status, he failed to inform immigration officials that he had been convicted on 17 separate criminal offenses in his native country. Within 3 months of being sent back home, Rader attempted to return to the US, but was arrested on passport fraud and ended up receiving a 3-year sentence at a federal prison in Phoenix. Now that Rader was incarcerated, the LA District Attorney's Office elected to use this opportunity to gradually build a case against him again. Rader was released after serving only 1 year of his sentence, but was immediately taken into custody by the Immigration and Naturalization Service to face a deportation hearing. Before he could be sent back to England, Rader was charged with the murders of the Salomon family in September of 1988. If found guilty at trial, he could have potentially faced the death penalty. However, there were no bodies or physical evidence connecting him to the crime, and Ashley Paul refused to return to the U.S. to testify against his cousin, so the case against Rader would be very circumstantial. At trial, a witness for the prosecution testified that she saw Rader's car in the desert near Acton when the Salomons went missing, but the defense was able to counter with a witness who placed Rader at a car auction at that time. They also produced a prostitute who testified that she was with Sol on the evening of October 12th, which seemed to go against the claim that Rader was the last person to see him alive. The defense attempted to deflect the focus from their client by pushing forward their own theory that Sol was involved with illegal activities such as drugs and firearms, which ultimately led to the murders of himself and his family. When the case went to the jury, deliberations took several weeks, and led to a bizarre tie-in with another sensational trial which happened to be taking place in the same courthouse at that time. Many of you are probably familiar with the McMartin preschool trials, in which many people associated with that school were charged with numerous counts of sexually abusing children, though no convictions were ever obtained. Anyway, at the time Rader's trial was taking place, the school's administrator, Peggy McMartin Buckey, was on trial in the adjacent courtroom. While deliberations were taking place in the Rader trial, one of the jurors just happened to climb onto the same elevator as Buckey. The exact nature of the conversation is up for debate, but the juror allegedly overheard Buckey make some comments about the Salomon family murders before she identified herself. Well, as you might know, jurors are forbidden from discussing their case with outsiders while the trial is taking place, so the judge feared this exchange may have compromised the integrity of the jury. As a result, the juror was dismissed and replaced by an alternate, so deliberations had to start all over again. In the end, the jury voted 11-1 in favor of convicting Rader, but since they could not reach a unanimous verdict, the whole thing ended in a mistrial. Rader went back on trial again in January of 1990, but before things could even get started, a mistrial was immediately declared. Rader was represented by a deputy public defender named Mark Lessam, but it turned out that the public defender's office where Lessem worked was representing the prosecution's key witness in an unrelated drunk driving case. This created a conflict of interest, so Lessem was dismissed as Rader's attorney, and he was forced to seek new representation. Rader finally went on trial for the third time in May of 1992, and this time around, instead of trying to convince the jury that alternate suspects murdered the Salomons, the defense's strategy was to push forward the theory that the Salomons might not have even been murdered at all. Apparently, the main reason the lone holdout juror at Rader's first trial did not vote guilty was because they believed that the Salomons might still be alive. At trial, the defense produced 3 witnesses who testified that they saw Sol in the town of Carpinteria, located approximately 85 miles west of Los Angeles. These witnesses included a gas station attendant and a pharmacist, along with a civilian dispatcher from the Carpinteria Police Department, who corroborated the sighting of Sol inside the pharmacy. These sightings all took place after October 12th, which countered the prosecution's claims that Rader had murdered the entire family that night. This strategy seemed to plant seeds of doubt inside the jury's heads, as this time around, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Rader not guilty and acquitted him of the murders. Rader continued to maintain his innocence and claimed that he wished to remain living in the United States. The authorities wanted to deport Rader to England, but it's unclear if this actually took place, and the current whereabouts of Rader and Ashley Paul are unknown. Over the past 3 decades, dozens of searches have been performed of the Antelope Valley area for the Salomon family's bodies, including a search of a 100-foot mine shaft in the area in 2000, but nothing has ever been found. The Salomons, along with Peter and Joan Davis, are officially still missing persons, and debate remains about whether or not Harvey Rader was actually responsible for their disappearances. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, it goes without saying that this case is an exercise in frustration. An entire family goes missing, and a promising suspect is arrested, but he's acquitted at trial, and the victims' bodies are never found. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that just because someone is acquitted does not necessarily mean they were innocent of the crime they were charged with. If Harvey Rader was guilty all along, then there really isn't much else that can be done, since double jeopardy prevents him from ever being charged again. But it's especially frustrating when the victims are still missing. Imagine being friends or relatives of the Salomons, and believing that not only has the perpetrator escaped justice, but that he knows where their remains are, but will likely never talk. Now don't get me wrong, I think there's very good reason to be suspicious of Harvey Rader, as he had an extensive criminal history. I mean, he shares the names of 2 infamous serial killers, Donald Harvey, the Angel of Death, and Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, so of course he's sketchy as hell. But all joking aside, you still have to ask yourself, if you were on the jury at one of Rader's trials, would you have considered the evidence against him to be strong enough to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? I mean, there were no bodies, no physical evidence, or witnesses linking Rader to the crime, and no murder weapons. The one witness who did implicate him, Ashley Paul, had already proved himself to be unreliable, and never even testified at the trials. While Rader definitely had some major inconsistencies in his story, and was the last known person to see the victims alive, is that really enough to potentially sentence him to death? Of course, there's also the fact that Rader had ties to 2 other missing people, Peter and Joan Davis, and it seems like quite a coincidence that Rader would be linked to 2 missing persons cases which occurred in San Fernando Valley within 6 months of each other. But of course, there was no direct evidence that the Davises were murdered, so Rader was never even charged with that crime. During my intro, I compared this case to the McStay family disappearance, and there are definitely a lot of parallels here. Their alleged killer, Chase Merritt, was a business partner of Joseph McStay, and financial gain was his alleged motive for murdering the entire family and burying their bodies in the Mojave Desert. As of this recording, Chase Merritt's trial has already been postponed numerous times, and is not scheduled to begin until January of 2019. On the surface, the evidence against Merritt seems a lot stronger than the evidence against Harvey Rader, and in this particular case, the victims were found. But in both cases, it's been alleged that the perpetrator brutally murdered innocent children because their relationship with their father went sour, and that's pretty horrifying. But before we talk about the suspects, let's talk about the Salomons. In particular, the patriarch of the family, Sol Salomon, as there may have been some major skeletons in that guy's closet. At the time the family went missing, Elaine's parents, Marie and Marge Malarowitz, told the media that Sol was a good man and that Elaine's marriage to him was a very happy one. Well, during a recent article in Los Angeles Magazine, Stacy Perman claims that she went to visit Marge in 2007 when she was 91 years old, and Marge now painted a much different picture of her former son-in-law. Marge now admitted that she hated Sol and blamed him for the family's deaths, as he was apparently involved in shady business deals and often kept stacks of cash hidden around the house behind picture frames. Sol also allegedly cheated on Elaine with prostitutes, and the marriage was miserable. In fact, Marge claimed that Elaine was having an affair of her own and planning to leave Sol, but Marge talked her out of it because of the financial security Sol provided for the family. Obviously, Marge came to regret that advice, and there is definitely a lot of credence to her allegations that Sol may have been involved in something shady. Right from the outset, investigators openly expressed their surprise that Sol was able to afford a nice house in San Fernando Valley, a Mercedes, and a Rolls-Royce, as his fire extinguisher business only netted him around $30,000 per year. Sure, Sol could have earned extra money through his business with Harvey Rader's car dealership, but his lifestyle clearly exceeded his income. During the early newspaper articles about the case, there's a strange comment from Police Chief Daryl Gates, who states that police were, quote-unquote, aware of Sol Salomon prior to the disappearances, but declined to provide any more specifics, other than to say that Sol was not engaged in illegal activity and that he wasn't a witness in a criminal case. So what did Chief Gates mean when he said the police were aware of Sol? Of course, there were always rumors that Sol had ties with the Israeli mafia and was involved with drugs and firearms, a theory which Rader's defense team pushed forward at his first trial to explain the family's disappearance, but none of this was ever substantiated. Of course, one of the biggest discrepancies in Rader's original story to police is that he claimed he went to a car auction with Sol on the night he vanished, but it turned out this auction ended at 5 p.m., and Sol did not actually leave his house until 6 p.m. But here's what's most interesting. While Rader was caught in a lie, technically Sol was too. As you'll recall, the Malarowitzes were at the Salomon home when Sol left at 6 p.m., and he also told them he was going to this car auction. But if the auction ended 1 hour earlier, then Sol wasn't telling his family the truth. So you can easily infer that Sol was up to something that night, which he didn't want his family to know about. If he went to see Rader, then that's a good indication that their business relationship extended beyond buying, repairing, and selling used cars. Before I discuss Harvey Rader and Ashley Paul, I guess I should examine potential alternate suspects. I know that Marge claimed that Elaine was having an affair at the time of her disappearance, but since she put up the public facade that the Salomons had a happy marriage, it's unclear if she shared this information with the police, and if this alleged boyfriend of Elaine's was looked at as a possible suspect. As far as I can tell, we really only have the word of a 91-year-old woman that this affair took place, so I'm not sure if it has any significance. And of course, there's the theory that Sol was involved in criminal activity with someone else who wasn't Harvey Rader, such as the Israeli mafia, but got in way over his head, and they retaliated by murdering him and his entire family. However, that's nothing more than speculation, and while I certainly wouldn't discount the fact that Sol became involved with some dangerous criminal figures, the only criminal he can be conclusively linked to is Harvey Rader, the last known person to have seen Sol and his family alive. Not only did Sol tell everyone he was going to a car auction with Rader before he vanished, but the last time anyone heard from Elaine was during a phone call with a friend where she said she had to go because Rader was at the front door. If you believe the scenario put forth by the prosecution at Rader's trials, then that means Elaine and her children were murdered almost immediately after that call ended. To be fair, Rader did provide an explanation for being at the Salomon home that night, as he claimed he went to the front door to pick up the keys for the family's Mercedes from Elaine so he could drive the car to his garage for some repair work. That might be easier to believe if it weren't for some other noticeable holes in Rader's story, such as his claim that he dropped Sol off at a restaurant which happened to be closed that night. But if Rader was responsible, the most baffling part is trying to figure out how these events unfolded, and I guess it would depend on how much credence you put into the story provided by Ashley Paul. So according to Paul, Rader shot Sol in the head at Mr. Motor because Sol demanded repayment of the $20,000 he had invested in the business. But the part that I cannot comprehend is why Rader would feel the need to make the extra trip to Sol's house to murder his entire family. It sounds like Rader believed he had to eliminate them because they knew Sol was going to see him before he was killed. Of course, Murray and Marge Malarowitz were also with Sol when he told them he was meeting with Rader, and they shared this information with the police, but Rader probably didn't know that the Malarowitzes had been there that night. Elaine also mentioned Rader's name during her final phone call with her friend, so if Rader's sole motive for murdering Elaine, Michelle, and Mitchell was to cover up the fact that Sol had gone to meet him, then the entire crime was completely pointless. The thing which doesn't make sense to me is that Rader would kill Sol quickly with a gunshot to the head, yet he would murder an innocent family in a much more brutal, protracted fashion, which involves strangling a teenage girl and beating a 9-year-old boy to death with a baseball bat. In my eyes, this suggests there was something a lot more personal about the crime than a business dispute. But then again, Chase Merritt allegedly bludgeoned Joseph McStay's 2 children, who were both much younger than Michelle and Mitchell, with a sledgehammer, so monsters can be capable of anything. The big question here is, how true is Ashley Paul's version of events? You'll recall that Paul failed multiple lie detector tests and flat out admitted that he made up many aspects of his original story, like Rader's 2 fictitious Italian accomplices who helped him commit the murders. Paul was also unable to lead authorities to the Salomon family's bodies, as well as the remains of Peter and Joan Davis. But before we delve any further into Paul, we should talk a little more about the Davises, as they are also missing victims who tend to be forgotten in this story. I might have an easier time believing that Rader and Paul had no involvement with what happened to the Salomons were it not for the Davises' disappearance. The Davises lived only 2 miles away from the Salomons. They both did business with Rader's car dealership, and Paul just happened to be their next-door neighbor. It just seems impossible that these 2 cases couldn't be connected, yet it's odd that the circumstances of how the Davises and the Salomons went missing are much different. The Davises' luggage, their dog, and a valuable piece of artwork were gone from their house, and their car was found parked at the airport, which was supposed to create the impression that they took off voluntarily, though it doesn't look like anyone actually believed that. But with the Salomon family disappearance, they didn't even try to give off the impression that they left on their own, as there was considerable blood evidence found in Michelle's bedroom, all their valuables and vehicles were left behind, and their wallets and passports were discovered by the side of the freeway. So of course, it was obvious right from the outset that they were victims of foul play. Now, one of the big issues with Paul's story is that in both the murders of the Davises and the Salomons, he places himself at the scenes witnessing Rader kill the victims and later helps him dispose of the bodies, but Paul never actually admits to inflicting any violence on anyone. For the most horrific part of this crime, which involved the murder of 2 children, Paul completely fabricated 2 non-existent Italians who accompanied Rader into the Salomon home while he waited outside, and I can't think of any other reason he would do this unless he wanted to avoid admitting his own culpability. So it seems very likely that Paul was a much more active participant in the murders than he let on. However, one thing I've always found weird is why Paul would turn himself into the authorities and agree to testify against Rader to begin with. Even though investigators always had their suspicions about Paul, they had no evidence that he committed a crime, and he was living safely over 5,000 miles away in London. It was only after he was hounded by private investigator Joe Sampson and received word that some Israelis were planning to hurt him in retaliation for the Salomons that Paul decided to go to the authorities, but if he hadn't done that, it's unlikely they would have uncovered enough evidence to pin anything on him. So Paul was either in fear for his life, or had developed a conscience about what he had done, but whatever his motivation, It doesn't sound like it was strong enough to compel him to make a full confession and tell the full truth about what happened. If Paul had a game plan, it backfired in a huge way when the authorities couldn't make a case against Rader and charged Paul with all the murders instead. I wonder if the way things actually played out was a reverse scenario to what Paul described. Instead of being a passive witness to the murders and an active participant in the disposal of the bodies, Paul was actually an active participant in the murders, but had no involvement in getting rid of the bodies. That would explain why Paul was unable to lead authorities to the locations where both the Salomons and the Davises were allegedly buried. The lead detective on the case also theorized that perhaps Paul's failure to find the bodies was intentional because he believed that without any bodies, nobody could be prosecuted for the crime. We should also address Paul's claim that Rader confessed to murdering another missing person, businessman Ronald Adib, who vanished in January of 1982. Since no evidence was found to corroborate this, no one was ever charged in connection to Adib's disappearance. Unfortunately, there is virtually no information out there about Adib, as he doesn't even have his own profile on the Charlie Project or any other missing persons websites. But if what Paul said was true, then this would mean Rader was responsible for the disappearance and murder of at least 7 people during a 10-month time frame, which is pretty insane. I mentioned earlier that the desert around Antelope Valley has been searched several times, and that they even looked for the Salomons' remains inside a mine shaft at one point. Of course, the family's passports and wallets were found alongside the Antelope Valley freeway, but some investigators have theorized that Rader may have actually disposed of the bodies at an entirely different location and planted the items there to throw the authorities off the trail. The lack of bodies is one of the main reasons that it was difficult to build a strong case against Rader at his trials. Securing a murder conviction without a body is certainly attainable, but this practice was far less common in the late 80s and early 90s, especially when there was a lack of strong physical evidence to work with. Since Rader had different defense attorneys at his first and third trial, it's quite fascinating to compare the different strategies they used. At the first trial, they tried to push forward the theory that Sol was involved in illegal activity with other dangerous criminal figures, which ultimately led to the entire family being murdered. But at the third trial, the defense drove home the theory that the Salomons were not actually murdered at all and disappeared voluntarily. This involved calling 3 witnesses to testify that they had seen Sol alive in another town after the date when Rader was alleged to have killed them. Amusingly enough, when Mark Lessam, Rader's public defender at his first trial, was asked about this years later, he stated that he did not believe these witnesses were credible. And I have to agree with this, as I believe there's very little chance that the Salomons were alive after October 12th, since the blood evidence clearly suggested that foul play had taken place inside their home. The only way these eyewitness sightings would be credible is if Sol himself actually murdered his entire family and took off, but since he left everything behind, and there hasn't been any other trace of him in 36 years, I find this very unlikely. I don't think any of the defense witnesses were lying, I just think they were probably mistaken, and saw someone else in Carpinteria who wasn't actually Sol. And yet, this eyewitness testimony seemed to convince the jury. It's quite ironic, because if you were to compare the 2 defense scenarios, the Salomons being murdered by an unknown third party, or them disappearing voluntarily, the first scenario does seem like the more plausible one. Yet this scenario led to a mistrial where the jury voted 11-1 in favor of conviction, while the far less plausible second scenario led to an acquittal. By the sound of things, Rader was more shocked than anybody about the verdict, and practically fainted when he heard the jury say, "not guilty." The defense team based their entire strategy on the opinion of the holdout juror from Rader's first trial, and I guess this just demonstrates that when it comes to juries, you can never accurately predict what they're going to do. But when all is said and done, in spite of the fact that I don't believe the defense's scenario about the Salomons still being alive, they did an effective job at generating reasonable doubt, and I can't really fault the jury for their verdict. Now, to be clear, I definitely think that Rader was guilty of this crime, or at the very least, had some sort of involvement in what happened, but the actual evidence which proved he did it was pretty weak. The one thing which placed Rader in the Salomon home on the night the family went missing was Elaine mentioning his name during her final phone call, but Rader did provide a cover story to explain his presence there, and the Salomons' Mercedes was found at his repair shop, just like he said. I think the one fatal mistake that the police made in this investigation is that they apparently did not perform a forensic search of the Mercedes after they retrieved it from Rader, as Elaine's family believed that he used the trunk to transport their bodies. If the police had done this, they might have found conclusive evidence to prove that Rader committed the murders. So if Rader was responsible, how did these events play out? Well, even though Ashley Paul was clearly not telling the whole truth when he shared his original story with the authorities, I do think there was some truth in there. Rader probably did kill Sol over a business dispute, and then decided to murder the rest of his family because they knew Sol had gone to meet him that night. However, I'm not so sure that Rader killed Sol over his $20,000 investment in the car dealership. Due to his expensive lifestyle, I do think that Sol was likely involved in something illegal, and since he lied to his family about accompanying Rader to a car auction, the two men were probably up to something shady that night, which eventually escalated into murder. Now, while double jeopardy prevents Rader from being charged again with the Salomon murders, he has never been charged in connection with the disappearances of Peter and Joan Davis. While the chances of this happening are slim after all this time, if the Davises' bodies were ever found, and evidence showed that Rader killed them, he could still conceivably go on trial for their murders, and there is technically still one small chance for justice in the Salomon case. Even though Ashley Paul was charged with the murders of the Salomons and the Davises in 1984, and they were subsequently dismissed, he was never put on trial for these crimes, so the door is still open to charge him again should new evidence surface. I've already established that I believe Paul had much more direct involvement in the murders than he let on, and it would not surprise me if he personally killed one or more of the victims. If that's the case, then Paul deserves to go to prison, and while it would be bittersweet for the Salomons' friends and relatives to know that Harvey Rader got away with it, at least they get to see someone face justice for their role in this crime. But unfortunately, so much time has passed that the chances of new evidence coming to light and an arrest being made are pretty low. In fact, I'm not even 100% sure if Harvey Rader or Ashley Paul are still alive today, as they would both be in their late 70s by now, and they seem to vanish off the face of the earth once their involvement in the investigation came to a close. But even if no one is ever convicted of this crime, the least that can be done is to find the victims' remains and bring them home so they can receive a proper burial. Marge Malarowitz always expressed sorrow that she was never able to properly say goodbye to her daughter and grandchildren, as Jewish tradition would not allow her to hold a proper funeral for them without their bodies. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearances of the Salomon family, the disappearances of Peter and Joan Davis, or even the unsolved disappearance of Ronald Adib, please contact the Los Angeles Police Department at 877-275-5273. That's 877-275-5273. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already released some exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and we'll be releasing another new one this month, so to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon, and they are Dee Dee Shirley J, Carol, and Aura. Thank you so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.